It is mentioned once that in a land of lush green hills and luxurious palaces, there lived a kind man who had 2 daughters, Samra and Sarah. His first wife had passed away and the sisters were each other's support. Both were possessors of extraordinary beauty. The elder sister Samra's golden hair shone in the sunlight, and her eyes were like the greenery of the jungle, while the younger sister Sarah's dark hair was adorned with pearls and her blue eyes were like the depths of the sea. But their beauty was not their only quality. Samra was a skilled carpet weaver who could weave a carpet to cover the whole kingdom, while Sarah was such a skilled weaver that she could prepare food for the whole country in the shell of an egg. Although their father was a loving man, he married a second time and his new wife hated sisters very much. This woman filled the husband's ears with poisonous words and convinced him that these girls were a burden for him. Finally, under the influence of this woman, the father, a young man, decided that he would leave his daughters in the wilderness and come back one morning. Under the pretext that he would go and get the juiciest apples, the father asked Samra and Sarah to accompany him to the orchard. In the joy of spending time with their father, the sisters dressed in their finest silk dresses. Samra wore a scarlet-colored dress with beautiful embroidery and Sarah wore a dark blue dress with tiny pearl embroidery that sparkled in the sunlight. As they followed their father into the forest, their laughter echoed in the trees, but they did not know that their father had already dug a deep pit and covered it with a delicate cloth that was almost indistinguishable from the ground. Climbing up the branches of a huge apple tree, it called out, "Come closer, dear daughter, the juiciest apples are here." Trusting their father completely, Samra and Sarah moved forward, and suddenly the ground disappeared under their feet. The world felt like it was spinning as they woke up in the dark. The last scene that their eyes saw was the face of their father, who was peeping into the pit. Grief was evident in his eyes. But then he turned his head and left them there. The pit was very deep. Its damp walls were closing around them. Sarah had held her sister's hand tightly. Her blue dress was soaked in mud, while Samra's red dress was giving a slight glow in the dim light. Days passed and hunger weakened them. In the beginning, Sarah tried to find some source of food with her expertise. She broke small stones and hoped that maybe there was something edible under them. But there was nothing there. When the end began to prevail, Samra prayed and her hands transformed into a hoe and the other into a pickaxe. A new ray of hope arose and she started digging the ground. Her golden hair was covered with mud, but there was a gleam of determination in her green eyes. After hours of exhausting hard work, Sarah, who had become weak, said in a low voice, "Finally, Samra's birch hand pierced the ground and a path was created." Light entered, and as they both stepped out, they were refreshed. They came out of the royal palace into its magnificent stable. The scent of horses and fresh hay surrounded them, and their bellies were rumbling with hunger at the sight of the golden almonds and juicy raisins kept for the royal horses. Helplessly, Sarah gathered a handful of almonds and raisins and shared them with her sister. For many nights, they stole only enough to stay alive. Their once magnificent silken clothes were now tattered, but still shone in the dim light of the stable. But soon the royal stablekeeper realized that the horses were getting weak and decided to find out the truth. One night he hid behind a stack of hay and watched as Sarah entered the stable. Her shiny black hair swayed in the moonlight. When she extended her hand towards the feed, the hermit immediately caught her wrist and walked her vigorously. The courtiers were called and the 2 sisters were dragged before the king, a young and majestic ruler dressed in deep red and gold. His sharp gaze softened when he saw Samra, who was standing with Waqar in her shiny but now dull attire, and Sarah, whose dark blue dress still reflected its former glory. "Who are you, and why are you stealing the fodder for my horses?" the king asked in a harsh tone, but instead of begging for mercy, Samra raised her head and confidently replied, "Alijah, we have stolen not out of greed, but for the sake of food. If you give us a chance, we can prove our worth." The king was impressed and asked what they could do. Sarah promised that she would weave a carpet that would cover the whole court, while Sarah said that she could prepare food for the whole court inside an eggshell. The king was skeptical, but he was also surprised, so he decided to test them. Sarah, the most magnificent embroidery of the sultanate, was given to her. With her expert fingers, she weaved a heart-wrenching carpet. The threads of gold and silver were mixed together in such a way that the mountains, the flow of rivers, and the reflection of the stars were visible. This magical cloth appeared to be spreading beyond the floor of the palace. Meanwhile, Sarah prepared her dish. She broke the shell of an egg, and with a slight movement of her fingers, she presented a wonderful feast. Delicious meat, aromatic rice, and hot naan, everything was presented in the delicate shell of egg. The court was stunned with surprise. The king, being impressed by her queen, got up from his throne and moved towards her. Then he said, "You are not just a thief." His eyes were fixed on Samra, whose beady eyes reflected silent greatness. Impressed by her courage and skill, the king proposed marriage to Samra, promising that he would always respect and honor her. Sarah was also given a special place in the palace with respect and honor, and she became the royal queen. Bawar Chan became famous, her mojiza dishes became famous in the whole country. The sisters who were once abandoned were now standing right in the royal palace. Their once torn clothes had now turned into royal silk, and their grief was replaced by happiness. When their father got the news of their rise, he started begging for forgiveness. But Samra, who was soft-hearted, knew that not every wound can be healed. With her sister and an entire kingdom in front of her, Samra ruled with grace. Her golden hair was adorned with jewels, and her pearly green eyes were always looking out for the needy. And Sarah, in her deep blue royal dress adorned with pearls, was making the streets fragrant with the aroma of her mojiza dishes, making sure that no one in her kingdom fell prey to hunger, as she herself was once. Thus, those two sisters who were once left alone became an example of patience, courage, and honor, and their names will always be remembered as golden words in history, woven into threads.